This unit's called the Modern Civil Rights Movement. I've updated the unit page today with this new link, and so you should be able to click in there and get around and start to see some things that are coming up. In this unit, we'll focus on these priority standards, and the calendar is coming together. For this lecture, I want to start with this link right here. It says Modern Civil Rights Slideshow Beginnings. I'll pull that up and we'll get going in this unit today. All right. The Modern Civil Rights Movement Beginnings. For this unit, we are still in the post-World War II period. In truth, the modern civil rights movement has been a struggle that's been going on as long as America had been a country. It was especially fervent right after the Civil War. If you remember, we've talked about this topic before with African American leaders such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. We've also brought this issue up in the progressive era as we talked about women's participation in government and women fighting to get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. Civil rights is an ongoing struggle for people to experience freedom and equality and the full rights that you get as a citizen of the United States. But in this unit, we're specifically talking about the modern civil rights movement. And what we mean by modern is after World War II. And for this lecture, we're just looking at the beginnings. This unit might take us from the 40s, 50s, 60s into the 70s, and you could really carry it out to the present. But for today, we're largely looking in the 1940s, 50s, and early 60s. This slide here, problems Black Americans were facing post-World War II. Now, the group most at the center of the modern civil rights movement is Black Americans. And for a lot of people, when you think of the modern civil rights movement, you're going to think of people like Martin Luther King or Rosa Parks or the struggle for African American rights. But several other groups are part of the struggle and will benefit from the breakthroughs. So in this unit, we will probably focus on Black Americans here at the beginning, especially before spring break over the next couple weeks. But then, even after spring break, we'll touch on some other groups Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, and women. And we'll talk about how they struggled for equality and how they had their own breakthroughs or were incorporated in part of the breakthroughs that came for the Black American community as well. For Black Americans, big areas that needed to be addressed. We might say these were the major goals of the modern civil rights movement. The first was to end segregation. Ever since World War II, slavery had been abolished, but African Americans, especially in the South, were living in a separate world from the majority of white Americans. We call this Jim Crow laws, or just the idea that that society could not coexist together and could only work if the races were separated. The legal precedent for that segregation was a court case in the 1890s, Plessy versus Ferguson, that legalized segregation as long as the separation was at least supposedly equal. They used the phrase separate but equal. So that's where you ended up with separate schools, separate restaurants, separate buses or transportation. And the separate was almost always enforced in the southern states. The equal part very rarely was. Other problems or areas that needed to be addressed was voting rights and equality. And when I say equality, we're talking about specifically in probably areas of economic opportunity and institutional or systemic racism or prejudiced areas. Voting rights and equality are something that we will probably focus on a little bit later in the unit, maybe later this week or early next. But for the next few days, probably here Monday through Thursday, we're really going to be looking at the issue of segregation and the steps that our country took to integrate whites and blacks in society. In the early part of the modern civil rights movement, the fight against segregation took priority. What I have listed on this screen, and then I'm going to click through a few pictures, are several either actions, legislations, and or protests that tackled segregation in a specific area or in a specific way. So as you read through these, you see there's the military, you see education, in Montgomery, busing. The sit-ins in Greensboro were about restaurants, and again, Freedom Riders was about busing again. So I'm going to kind of flip through here. I'm going to show you just a few pictures. I don't have a picture for the military, but it's important that you see World War II really did kind of kickstart the modern civil rights movement. During World War II, African Americans fought in the war, albeit in segregated units, but they also served in the home front. And if you remember A. Philip Randolph, he marched and pressured the government to integrate defense jobs during World War II. As a result, right after World War II, in 1948, Harry Truman, as president, through executive order, desegregated the military. And that's one of the first breakthroughs where segregation was eliminated. A very famous court case, 1954. It's the first court case of the Warren Court. Brown versus Board of Education says that separate schools, when it's based on race, separate schools are inherently unequal. And Brown versus Board of Education is going to begin the process of forcing the integration of public school. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow. I have a podcast assignment. I think the integration of public schools is instrumental in uh, in tolerance and racial understanding and beginning the process towards ending racism. However, tomorrow's podcast will show you some of the struggles that came as schools were integrated. It might not have been done in the most efficient manner possible. Rosa Parks is a name many are familiar with. She protested against the separate um, the the separate seating sections on buses. And let me skip up. I'm going to skip up to this picture. You can see this is a mugshot. She's going to be imprisoned for that. And this is something we'll talk about more on Wednesday and Thursday as well. The civil rights movement did not come without serious cost to those who participated, both in terms of their livelihoods and their money, but also in terms of their freedom. Many civil rights leaders are going to be imprisoned or jailed for their protests or their actions. And it took great courage to kind of break those rules and those norms in order to bring about an awareness of the injustice. Rosa Parks, after she is arrested for refusing to give up her seat in Montgomery, the Montgomery Improvement Association did a year-long boycott of the Montgomery bus system because they knew people of color were a huge financial resource to the city. That was a huge group that was going to be using those buses throughout the year, and by boycotting it, they put economic pressure on the city to end the segregation of busing in Montgomery, Alabama. Now, that is one specific group in one specific area putting a very specific type of economic pressure to achieve a goal. The question for the modern civil rights movement is, could enough of these little specific protests bring about widespread legislative change at the federal level? Here is a picture of the sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina. You can see there are white and black students sitting together at this lunch counter. And the idea was um, the restaurant would not serve people of color. And so this group, they were called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So a group of students who were going to be nonviolent, but they were going to coordinate together to come in and sit and say, we refuse to get up until you serve both of us, until you serve people of both races. And you can see the faces of the white audience there, and it looks like they're harassing and dumping and going through all kinds of acts of abuse. Again, there was a cost for the people who took part in these protests. Here's another uh, example of the cost. In this specific picture, what's being described is the Freedom Rider movement of 1961. In 1961, uh, public Greyhound buses were segregated, and these were not just in a local community like Montgomery. These buses, these Greyhound buses, traveled from state to state across state lines. And so a group of civil rights activists are going to get together, white and black, and they're going to get on these buses and they're going to travel from Washington, D.C., from the Virginia area, all the way south through states like the Carolinas and Georgia and Alabama. And as they moved through these southern states, each state that had these segregated laws would be frustrated and refuse to pass them along or to the next connection, or to refuse to allow them to get off and use the bus stop or to use the restrooms. And in this specific case, there was obviously a bombing and a fire set, an act of violence against this bus just because it had Black Americans on board. The idea of the Freedom Riders was, because these buses were crossing state lines, that this was a form of interstate commerce, and they were really putting pressure on the federal government to step in and enforce their rights and protect them from the state and local authorities of places like Georgia and Alabama. Um, Again, I'm going to skip back. In each of these cases, whether it be education, um, a local busing situation, local restaurants, or interstate travel, the idea is the same, that Jim Crow segregation laws are enacted and enforced at a local and state level. And if a protest or a movement can put enough pressure on the system, that maybe the federal government, Washington, D.C., the president could step in, Congress could step in and change the laws, or at least enforce the rights of our Constitution at the highest level. Um, here's the key understanding. At the top of this slide, I put the ideal and the actual. The key understanding of these early struggles for civil rights comes back to federalism. The federal government had granted full citizenship and rights to Black Americans after the Civil War. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. These are amendments that in class we'll spend a little bit more time talking about, but these are amendments passed after the Civil War that specifically gave Black Americans citizenship and rights. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment said, if you are born in this country, black, white, or whatever, you are a citizen and entitled to due process and equal protection. And the 15th Amendment specifically says the right to vote cannot be taken away on account of color or race. However, even though the federal government had granted all of these rights, and these are the ideals that our country wants to live up to, state governments and local authorities had circumvented the intentions of those federal amendments. Segregation laws and Jim Crow laws and other prejudice and discriminatory laws undermined these 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So the question for the modern civil rights movement was, could these individual protests, a boycott in Montgomery, a sit-in in Greensboro, a group of riders traveling on Greyhounds from state to state, could these individual protests break through to achieve some type of federal legislation that would triumph over these state level loopholes and prejudicial practices? Um, in federalism, certain powers are given to the federal government and certain powers are given to the state governments. This is intended to give states a certain level of control. But if state control is violating constitutional rights that the federal government has enacted, can they override? Will the federal government, in the name of civil rights, claim supremacy? Uh, a little bit of a spoiler alert, but a couple of the big breakthroughs. And the reason we celebrate the modern civil rights movement is because there are going to be federal laws passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 are going to be examples of the federal government acting to end these state prejudicial practices, such as Jim Crow, segregation, and other forms of discrimination. We'll talk more about those two acts specifically, as well as the problems of voting disenfranchisement and equal opportunity in another lecture and in other activities. But this is at least a start for us to begin the discussion of discrimination, ending it, and the modern civil rights movement. Thanks for listening.